There was a time when I thought I had everything figured out, when I believed the world would bend itself to my plans, when I measured my worth by the expectations others placed on me. I moved through life with a smile on my face, but deep down I was weighed down by doubts, insecurities, and the quiet fear of never being enough. I kept trying to mold myself into shapes that didn't belong to me, living for the approval of voices that weren't my own. I wore masks so often that I almost forgot what my true reflection even looked like. But then came a breaking point, a moment when silence was louder than any noise, when emptiness wrapped itself around me so tightly that I could hardly breathe. I had to face the truth. I wasn't really living. I was existing in shadows, chasing a version of life that was never mine to begin with. That moment was painful, but it was also the beginning of something extraordinary. From that darkness I began to rise, slowly, uncertainly, but with a quiet strength I didn't even know I carried. Every tear became a lesson, every scar a reminder that survival is not weakness, it is proof of courage. I started peeling away the layers of pretense, the ones I had worn for so long, and beneath them I discovered someone I thought I had lost. Someone strong, someone brave, someone real, and that is why I call myself born again. Not in the sense of starting over, but in the sense of finally seeing myself clearly. Born again into a life where I no longer apologize for existing, where I speak my truth even if my voice shakes, where I walk into rooms with my head held high, not because I am perfect, but because I am free. Being born again doesn't mean forgetting the past. It means embracing it as part of the story that shaped me, but refusing to let it chain me anymore. It means forgiving myself for the times I settled for less than I deserved. It means letting go of old fears and daring to dream again. It means building a life not from the pieces others handed to me, but from the fire that now burns within me. Today, I am born again into confidence, into strength, into self-love. I am born again into the belief that I am worthy, not because of what I do for others, not because of how flawless I appear, but because of who I truly am. There was a time when life felt like a constant performance, where every step I took was measured against someone else's standards, and every word I spoke was filtered through the lens of how it might be received. I smiled when I was expected to smile, nodded in agreement when my heart longed to say no, and carried myself as if I was content while inside I was suffocating. I thought approval was the key to happiness, that if I could meet the expectations of others, I would finally feel whole. But the truth was, the more I gave to this illusion, the emptier I became. I would look in the mirror and hardly recognize the girl staring back at me because her eyes carried a tiredness that no one else seemed to notice. I dressed in ways that I thought would please others, spoke in ways that would not disturb the peace, and suppressed every thought that might make me seem too bold, too loud, or too different. Slowly, I began to realize that in my pursuit of pleasing others, I had lost myself completely. The weight of constantly needing validation became unbearable. Every compliment felt temporary, every acknowledgement faded too quickly, and I found myself desperate for the next sign of approval, like a thirst that could never be quenched. It was a cycle that drained me of energy, and even when I achieved what others praised, there was no joy in it because deep down I knew it wasn't me. I was living a life built on borrowed dreams and borrowed standards, molding myself into shapes that never truly fit. I convinced myself that this was what life was meant to be, that blending in and silencing my true desires was safer than risking rejection. Yet with each day, the emptiness inside grew louder, and I could no longer ignore it. There were moments when I would sit in silence and feel the hollowness of my own choices pressing down on me. The laughter I shared with others felt rehearsed, the conversations I held seemed distant, and the relationships I clung to only reinforced the idea that my worth was measured by how well I could serve the needs of others. The approval I chased was a fleeting currency, and when it ran out, I was left with nothing but a profound sense of loneliness. I longed for someone to see me for who I really was, yet I had hidden myself so well that even I struggled to find the real me. The more I tried to be perfect in the eyes of others, the more I lost sight of the imperfect, messy, and beautiful truth of my own identity. It was not one dramatic event, but rather a series of small realizations that opened my eyes to how much I had been living outside myself. Each time I suppressed a thought, each time I swallowed a dream, each time I ignored the voice inside me that whispered I deserved more, a little part of me faded away. And one day I could no longer deny that I was living someone else's life, not my own. The approval I sought was never enough because it was not the approval I truly needed. What I needed was to approve of myself, to accept that my worth was not defined by how much I pleased others, but by the simple fact of being who I was created to be. The discovery of this emptiness was painful because it forced me to confront the truth that I had wasted so much time trying to be everything for everyone else. But it was also a moment of awakening, a quiet but powerful realization that I could no longer afford to live like this. I began to see the cracks in the mask I had worn for so long, and for the first time I allowed myself to question why I had put it on in the first place. The more I asked myself these questions, the clearer it became that I had been sacrificing my happiness for a kind of acceptance that was never real. In discovering this emptiness, I also discovered that I was capable of more, that my heart longed for authenticity, for freedom, for the chance to live a life that was truly mine. The breaking point did not arrive with a loud crash or an obvious sign that everyone around me could see. It came quietly, almost silently, like a shadow creeping in until it surrounded me completely. I remember the stillness of it, the way everything I had been holding inside could no longer be ignored. It was as if all the masks I had worn slipped at once, leaving me face to face with the reality that I was exhausted from pretending. I felt stripped bare, unable to keep carrying the weight of expectations, the endless cycle of pleasing others, and the silent fear of disappointing everyone around me. That breaking point was not about a single event, but rather the collection of countless small moments where I had silenced myself, where I had buried my dreams, where I had ignored the voice inside me that kept trying to be heard. The quiet grew so heavy that it demanded my attention, and for the first time I had no choice but to listen. In that moment, I felt like I had reached the edge of myself. There was nowhere left to run, nowhere to hide from the emptiness that was consuming me. I realized I had been so busy existing for others that I had forgotten what it meant to live for myself. The breaking point forced me to confront the truth that I was not happy, not fulfilled, and not even close to being the girl I once dreamed of becoming. I thought I could keep carrying on, thought I could continue moving through the motions, but the stillness revealed that I was only drifting further from who I really was. There was a hollowness in my chest, a silence so loud it echoed in every thought, and in that silence I knew something had to change. The breaking point was painful, but it was also raw and honest. For once, I was not pretending. I was not smiling when I wanted to cry, not nodding when I wanted to scream, not agreeing when I wanted to walk away. I was simply there with all my fears, doubts, and broken pieces spread out before me. It was terrifying, yet strangely freeing. It was the first time I had allowed myself to acknowledge the truth without covering it up. The truth that I was lost, the truth that I was tired of being what everyone wanted me to be, the truth that I could not keep living this way without losing myself completely. I remember the way tears would come unexpectedly, not because of something someone said, but because of the realization that I had been holding them back for so long. Every tear felt like a release. Every moment of weakness felt like a step closer to honesty. At first I fought against it, tried to convince myself that I was fine, that this was just another phase I could push through. But the more I resisted, the heavier the emptiness became until it was no longer possible to hide. The breaking point demanded that I stop running, stop hiding, and face myself exactly as I was. It was in this breaking that I began to see what strength really meant. Strength was not the ability to keep smiling when I was crumbling inside. Strength was not the ability to silence my heart for the sake of others. Strength was allowing myself to feel, to break, to admit that I was not okay. In that vulnerable state, I began to discover pieces of myself I had forgotten. My courage, my voice, my dreams that had been buried under years of trying to be what others expected. The breaking point showed me that sometimes falling apart is the only way to finally see the truth of what needs to change. Every memory of that season is etched into me. The long nights spent in thought, the mornings when I struggled to get out of bed, the countless moments when I questioned whether I had the ability to move forward. And yet, through the pain, there was also a spark, a whisper that perhaps this breaking was not the end, but the beginning of something I had been waiting for without even realizing it. The silence that once suffocated me began to feel like space, space to reflect, space to rebuild, space to let go of everything that no longer belonged. The breaking point was the place where I had to choose, to either continue living a life that drained me, or to take the terrifying step into the unknown of becoming myself again. It was not easy, it was not instant, but it was the first time I allowed myself to believe that I deserved more than approval, more than survival, more than the empty validation that had controlled me for so long. It was in that fragile and painful moment that the possibility of change became real, and though I didn't yet know what the path ahead would look like, I knew that staying the same was no longer an option. Scars have a way of telling stories even when words fail, and mine became quiet reminders of the journey I had walked through. They were not always visible to the eye, but I carried them in my heart, in the corners of my mind, and in the subtle ways I moved through the world. For a long time I tried to hide them, tried to pretend they didn't exist, because I thought they made me weak, broken, or less worthy. I wanted so desperately to appear untouched, flawless, and strong in the way others defined strength. But as I began to look at those scars differently, I realized they were not signs of weakness at all. They were evidence of survival, proof that I had endured battles that once felt impossible. Every scar I carried, whether on my body or in my soul, was a mark of resilience, a chapter in the story of how I kept standing even when it felt easier to fall. There were nights when I would trace the invisible scars of words that had cut me, of disappointments that had shaken me, of moments when I thought I would never rise again. The pain had been real, the tears endless, but those scars became reminders that I had not been defeated. I had felt pain deeply, but I had also healed, and healing is never weakness. Healing takes courage, patience, and the willingness to keep going when everything inside screams to stop. The scars reminded me that I had chosen to endure, that I had chosen to fight for myself even in silence. Each scar told a different story. Some spoke of loss, of the moments when things I had held onto slipped from my hands no matter how tightly I tried to keep them. Others told of rejection, of times when I was made to feel like I was not enough, when my voice was drowned out by louder ones. Still others whispered of fear, of nights spent wrestling with doubts that threatened to consume me. But no matter the story, every scar carried the same message. I survived. I walked through fire and came out the other side. I faced storms that shook me to my core, yet here I was, still standing, still breathing, still fighting to be myself. For so long, I thought I had to erase my scars to be beautiful, to be worthy of love, to be accepted. I tried to cover them with smiles, with perfection, with silence. I tried to pretend they weren't there, but the truth is, scars do not make me less, they make me more. They are proof of my humanity, proof that I have lived, loved, lost, and learned. They show that I am not untouched, but that I am real, that I have endured and risen again. When I began to embrace them instead of hiding them, I found a new kind of strength, one that did not depend on perfection but on authenticity. There is power in scars because they remind us of what we are capable of surviving. They remind us that even at our weakest moments, there was something inside us strong enough to carry us through. They remind us that wounds do not last forever, that pain does not define us, and that healing is always possible. Each scar became a badge of honor, not something to be ashamed of, but something to carry with pride, because it symbolized the battles I had won against fear, against doubt, against despair. Began to see my scars as strength. I stopped apologizing for them. I stopped feeling the need to explain why they were there or to cover them with layers of pretense. I let them speak for themselves, quietly, powerfully, reminding me every day that resilience is born in struggle. Strength is not about never falling, it is about rising every time I do. My scars became teachers, showing me that I was far braver than I had ever believed, that I was capable of rebuilding even after being broken. In embracing my scars, I also found compassion for myself. I learned to forgive the girl who had once hidden them, the girl who had once thought weakness was something to be ashamed of. I learned to love the parts of me that had once felt unworthy because those very parts carried the proof of survival. The scars did not hold me back, they pushed me forward, reminding me that if I had endured the past, I could face whatever lay ahead. They were not chains, they were wings, lifting me into a new understanding of what it means to be strong. Letting go of the past was not something that happened all at once. It was a slow and delicate process, like peeling away layers that had been wrapped around me for years. I had carried so much weight from memories, from mistakes, from words that had cut deep and lingered long after they were spoken. I carried guilt for the times I settled for less than I deserved, regret for the moments I silenced myself, and shame for the ways I had allowed others to define me. The past clung to me like a shadow, following me into every new step I tried to take, whispering doubts, reminding me of failures, and keeping me bound to cycles I wanted to escape. It was easier to hold on than to let go, because holding on was familiar, but familiarity does not mean freedom. I had to face the truth that clinging to the past was stopping me from living the life that was waiting for me. There were times when I would replay old conversations in my mind, dissecting every word, wondering what I could have said differently, wondering how things might have turned out if I had been braver or stronger. There were nights when I lay awake thinking about opportunities I had missed, choices I had made out of fear, moments when I had allowed silence to replace my voice. The past had a way of convincing me that it defined me, that I was trapped in the mistakes and disappointments that had already happened, but the more I held on to it, the more it drained me. It was like carrying a heavy bag everywhere I went, filled with everything I wished I could forget but refused to release. Letting go began with forgiveness, forgiving myself for not knowing better, for not standing up for myself sooner, for not being the girl I thought I should have been. I had to accept that I cannot rewrite what has already been written, but I can choose how the story continues. Forgiveness was not easy. It meant facing the pain without hiding from it, acknowledging the times I had hurt myself by holding on too tightly to people, to situations, to versions of me that no longer existed. But in forgiving, I began to loosen the grip the past had on me. I realized that my worth was not determined by the moments that broke me, but by the way I rose after them. Another part of letting go was understanding that some people, no matter how much they meant to me, belonged to my past and not to my future. There were connections I held onto long after they had stopped giving me life, because I feared what it would mean to walk away. I thought letting go would mean losing, but I came to see that sometimes letting go is the only way to make space for something better. Releasing old attachments did not mean forgetting the love or the lessons. It meant acknowledging that I had outgrown certain spaces and that staying in them was keeping me small. The past also lived in my fears, in the way I hesitated to take chances because I remembered the times I had failed. It lived in the way I held myself back, telling myself I wasn't ready, not because I wasn't capable, but because I couldn't stop looking behind me. Letting go meant daring to believe in possibility again, daring to dream without the weight of every disappointment dragging me down. It meant choosing to walk forward without constantly turning back, trusting that the future could hold something brighter than what I had left behind. With every step of letting go, I began to feel lighter. The things that once haunted me lost their power, the wounds that once bled became healed spaces, and the regrets that once echoed became quiet reminders instead of heavy burdens. I started to see myself not as someone trapped by the past, but as someone who had learned from it. I realized that letting go did not mean erasing my history, it meant releasing its hold on my future. The past could still be part of my story, but it no longer had to be the chapter I lived in forever. Letting go gave me the courage to reclaim my self-worth, to say no to what no longer served me, to choose myself without guilt. It allowed me to see that I am not the sum of my mistakes, not defined by the people who walked away, not confined by the times I fell short. I am more than what I left behind, and in releasing it, I began to uncover a version of myself that had been waiting all along, the version that was ready to live fully, freely, and without apology. Stepping into a new life of confidence, freedom, and self-love was not a single decision, but a journey that unfolded slowly, one moment at a time. For so long I had been taught to measure my worth through the eyes of others, to shrink myself so I would not take up too much space, to hide the parts of me that felt too loud or too different. But as I began to shed those old beliefs, I realized that confidence was not about being flawless. Freedom was not about running away, and self-love was not about vanity. Confidence was about trusting my own voice even when it shook. Freedom was about giving myself permission to live without apology, and self-love was about embracing every part of me, even the ones I once tried to erase. The first steps felt shaky. Standing tall after years of bowing to expectations was not easy. Speaking up after years of silencing myself was terrifying. Looking in the mirror and choosing kindness instead of criticism felt unnatural at first. But each time I pushed past the fear, I grew stronger. Confidence came in small victories, raising my voice when it mattered, choosing to wear what made me feel alive instead of what made me blend in, admitting my dreams out loud without feeling embarrassed. Every act of courage built upon the last, and slowly the girl who once doubted everything began to see herself as capable, worthy, and brave. Freedom came with choices too, the freedom to walk away from what drained me. The freedom to set boundaries and no longer feel guilty for saying no. The freedom to explore who I was without needing permission or approval. It was liberating to realize that I didn't have to be confined by old roles, by old fears, or by the narrow definitions of what others thought I should be. Freedom was not about escaping life. It was about stepping fully into it, with the courage to live by my own truth. It was about knowing that I could choose where to go, who to be, and how to love myself without chains holding me back. Self-love, however, was the deepest lesson of all. It meant learning to be patient with myself when I stumbled, to forgive myself when I fell short, to celebrate even the smallest progress. It meant looking at my flaws not as reasons for shame, but as parts of what made me human. It meant treating myself with the same compassion I so easily offered to others. Self-love was not loud or showy. It was quiet, steady, and unshakable. It was in the way I began to speak to myself with gentleness, in the way I chose to rest instead of punishing myself for being tired, in the way I finally allowed myself to take up space in this world without apology. There were moments when I doubted whether I deserved this new life. Years of conditioning whispered that confidence was arrogance, that freedom was selfishness, that self-love was indulgence. But I began to see that those whispers were lies, and that living small was not humility, but fear. True humility was knowing my worth without needing to prove it. True freedom was being authentic without fear of judgment. True self-love was honoring the girl I had been, the woman I was becoming, and the future I was building. The new life I stepped into was not free from challenges, but I carried myself differently through them, Where I once would have bent under pressure, I now stood with resilience. Where I once would have doubted myself, I now reminded myself of how far I had come. Where I once would have begged for validation, I now gave it to myself first. Confidence, freedom, and self-love became the pillars of a life that felt truly mine. Every day was a choice to keep stepping into that life. To choose courage over fear, to choose authenticity over approval, to choose compassion over criticism. It was not always easy, but it was always worth it. I began to see joy in places I had overlooked, to feel pride in moments I once dismissed, to find peace in simply being myself. The life I was creating was no longer about survival or about meeting expectations. It was about thriving, about embracing the fullness of who I was, and about walking into each day with the belief that I was enough exactly as I was.